Section 20 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 4, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anne Boulay. Catherine Howard, Chapter 1, Part 1. The fifth consort of Henry VIII was a daughter of that illustrious house, of which a modern writer thus eloquently writes: "What family pervades our national annals with achievements of such intense and brilliant interest as the Howards? As heroes, poets, politicians, courtiers, patrons of literature, state victims to tyranny and revenge, they have been constantly before us for 4 centuries. In the drama of life they have exhibited every variety of character, good and bad, and the tale of their vices, as well as their virtues, is full of instruction. No story of romance or tragedy can exhibit more incidents to enchain attention or move the heart than might be found in the records of this great historical family." The career of Catherine Howard affords a grand moral lesson, a lesson better calculated to illustrate the vanity of female ambition, and the fatal consequences of the first unguarded steps in guilt, than all the warning essays that have ever been written on those subjects. No female writer can venture to become the apologist of this unhappy queen, yet charity may be permitted to whisper, ere the dark page of her few and evil days is unrolled: "Full gently scan thy brother, man; still gentler sister, woman." Catherine Howard, while yet a child in age, being deprived of a mother's watchful care, and surrounded by unprincipled persons of maturer years, made shipwreck of all her hopes on earth ere she knew the crime, the madness into which she was betrayed. Let no one who has been more fortunately circumstanced boast. John Bradford, one of the most illustrious of our Protestant martyrs, who afforded, in his own practice, a perfect exemplification of Christian holiness, when he beheld a criminal handcuffed and carried ignominiously to execution, exclaimed, "But for the grace of God, there goes John Bradford!" Catherine Howard was the cousin german of a previous victim of Henry VIII's stormy love and murderous caprice, the beautiful and ill-fated Anne Boleyn. She was his 5th wife, and the 3rd private gentlewoman whom he elevated to the perilous dignity of his queen. Although she was his subject, the lineage of this lady was, in some respects, not inferior to his own. Through her royal ancestress, Queen Adelicia, Catherine Howard was the descendant of the imperial race of Charlemagne. Margaret Brotherton, the granddaughter of Edward I and Margaret of France, transmitted the mingled blood of the Plantagenets and the kings of France to her descendants, by Thomas Mowbray, the heir of the Albinis, the Warrens, and the Bigods, and thus united, in a blended line, the posterity of Henry I and his 2 queens, Matilda the Good and Adelicia the Fair. Margaret of Brotherton was created Duchess of Norfolk, and claimed her father Thomas Plantagenet's office of Earl Marshal. Her claims were allowed, and she was called the Mareschal, but her son, Thomas Mowbray, was invested by her with the Marshal's rod, and acted as her deputy. His daughter, the Lady Margaret Mowbray, by Elisabeth, daughter of the famous Richard Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, brought the honours and demesnes of all these noble houses to her son by Sir Robert Howard. This was John, the 1st Duke of Norfolk, of the name of Howard. He was slain at Bosworth, and his dukedom was confiscated by Henry VII. Thomas, his eldest son, was the victorious Surrey of Flodden Field, and Edmund, the 9th son of Thomas, was the father of Catherine Howard. At this memorable battle, where the national glory of England was so signally advanced by the valour and military skill of Catherine's family, her father, at that time a beardless esquire, was the marshal of the English host, under the command of his renowned father. He led the right wing, and sustained unshrinkingly the fiery onslaught of Huntley and Home, though the Cheshire men fled, leaving, as the ancient record certifies, the said Master Edmund in a manner alone, without succour, by his banner, which he gallantly defended, verifying the chivalric aphorism which Scott, in after years, attached to the cognizance of his house: "For who, in field or foray slack, saw the blanched lion e'er give back." The standard bearer indeed was slain and hewn to pieces, and the stainless banner of Howard fell with him, but not before the dauntless Lion Sue of the house, who had so well maintained it, was himself thrice beaten down to the ground. But, like a courageous and hardy young gentleman, pursues our document, he recovered again, and fought hand to hand with Sir David Home, and slew him with his own hands. And thus the said Master Edmund was in great peril, till the Lord Dacre, like a good knight and true, came to his succour, and relieved him. After the battle, young Edmund received the well-earned honour of knighthood from the sword of his victorious father, and the forfeited dukedom of Norfolk was restored to the gallant Surrey as a reward for the good services he and his brave sons had performed for their king and country that day. Henry also granted the following augmentation of honour to the arms of Surrey and his posterity, namely, to bear on a bend in an escutcheon the upper half of a red lion, depicted as the arms of Scotland, pierced through the mouth with an arrow. After her marriage with the king, Catharine Howard bore the Flodden augmentation on the third quarter of her escutcheon, a proof that she was proud of the honour of her family, though, unhappily, regardless of her own. But deeply as this child of sinful passion erred, we should remember that her grandfather, her father, and her uncles performed good services for England, and advanced the glory of our country both by land and sea. Out of respect to their memories, we are bound to deal as gently by their unhappy kinswoman as the circumstances of the case will admit. Justice, indeed, requires that implicit credence should not be given to the statements of those who, without allowing her the benefit of a trial, brought her to the block unheard. Catharine Howard was the fifth child and second daughter of Lord Edmund Howard by Joyce or Jocosa, daughter of Sir Richard Culpeper of Hollingbourne in Kent, widow of Sir John Lee, knight. Catharine had 3 brothers and 1 sister older, and 3 sisters younger than herself. Lord Edmund Howard is enumerated among the noble bachelors who attended Mary Tudor to France in 1515, and, supposing he married soon after, the earliest date that can be given for Catharine's birth is 1521 or 1522. Lord Edmund possessed many houses in London, but Lambeth has been named as his residence, and probably this was the place of Catharine's nativity. Her mother died when Catharine was in early childhood, and her father married a second wife, Dorothy, the daughter of Thomas Troyes. On the death of his illustrious father, Thomas, Duke of Norfolk, Lord Edmund permitted his stepmother, Agnes Tilney, the Duchess Dowager, to take upon herself the entire charge and bringing up of the second daughter of his numerous family. It was an evil hour for the little Catharine, when she left the paternal roof and the society of the innocent companions of her infant joys and cares, to become a neglected dependent in the splendid mansion of a proud and heartless relative, and could her brave father have foreseen the consequences of this arrangement, it is easy to imagine how much rather he would have placed her on her bier than have permitted the demoralizing associations to which she was exposed in her new home. Lord Edmund Howard's duties compelled his residence at Calais during the latter years of his short life, or it is possible that his parental vigilance might have been alarmed in time to preserve his child from ruin. The Duchess of Norfolk was so perfectly unmindful of her duties to her orphan charge, that Catharine was not only allowed to associate with her waiting women, but compelled at night to occupy the sleeping apartment that was common to them all. Unhappily, they were persons of the most abandoned description, and seem to have taken a fiendish delight in perverting the principles and debasing the mind of the nobly born damsel who was thrown into the sphere of their polluting influence. Catharine, unfortunately for herself, while yet a child in age, acquired the precocious charms of womanhood, and before she had even entered her teens, became the object of illicit passion to a low-born villain in the household of the Duchess, named Henry Manox. He was a player on the virginals, probably Catharine's instructor on that instrument, and might take advantage of the opportunities too often afforded to persons in that capacity to prefer his suit, and by degrees to establish himself on terms of unbecoming familiarity with his pupil. Catharine was residing in the family of the Duchess at Horsham in Norfolk, when this degrading intimacy commenced, which was fostered and encouraged by one of the duchess's women, called Mistress Isabel, who was her confidant, and carried the tokens that were exchanged between her and Manox. When Mistress Isabel married and left the household of the Duchess of Norfolk, her place and office of confidant was supplied by a woman from the village of Horsham, of the name of Dorothy Barwyke. Soon after the Duchess of Norfolk removed with Katharine and her whole establishment to her house at Lambeth. Katharine's uncles, the Duke of Norfolk and Lord William Howard, had mansions also at Lambeth, which was at that time very much the resort of the nobles of Henry's court, and was considered as a very pleasant retreat, with its beautiful orchards and gardens sloping down to the banks of the Thames. The removal of the Duchess of Norfolk to Lambeth was in all probability for the purpose of attending the coronation of her granddaughter, Anne Boleyn, in whose court she made a considerable figure. The coronation of that queen and the christening of the Princess Elisabeth took place in the year 1533, when Catharine Howard, though probably too young to have any part assigned to her in royal ceremonials of state, was old enough to mar all her own hopes in life and to stain the hitherto unsullied honour of her house. It was while at Lambeth that she formed a fatal intimacy with a female of low birth, of the name of Mary Lassells, who was the nurse of her uncle Lord William Howard's first child by the daughter of Lady Russell. On the death of Lady William Howard in 1533, Mary Lassells entered the service of the Duchess of Norfolk, and was permitted to sleep in the dormitory which the young and lovely daughter of Lord Edmund Howard shared with the female attendants of the Duchess. Supposing Catharine Howard to have been born in 1521, the very earliest date that can be assigned for the birth of the fifth child of a man who was a bachelor in the close of the year 1515, then she would have been under 13 at the period when Mary Lassells was added to the menage of the Duchess, a fact which makes the following circumstances most melancholy. Mary Lassells very soon began to discuss with Catharine's trusty confidant, Dorothy Barwyke, the intrigue in which that unprincipled woman was lending her aid to involve the hapless child. Barwyke told Lassells that Manox was insured, that is contracted or troth plight, to Mistress Catharine Howard, with whom he was much in love. On this, Lassells, whose indignation at the supposed passion of the musician for the young lady inspires a suspicion that she was actuated by jealousy, said to him with some warmth, "Man, what meanest thou to play the fool of this fashion? Knowest thou not that an my lady of Norfolk knew of the love between thee and Mistress Howard, she will undo thee, and besides this, she is come of a noble house, and if thou shouldest marry her, some of her blood will kill thee." Manox replied in the most profligate language to this remonstrance that his designs were of a dishonourable nature, and, from the liberties the young lady had allowed him, he doubted not of being able hereafter to effect his purpose. When Mary Lassells repeated this to Catharine, she was greatly offended with Manox, cried, "Fie upon him," said, "she cared not for him," and then, unable to control or defer the effusion of her indignation, she proceeded with Mary Lassells in quest of him to the house of Lord Beaumont, where he was, and there passionately upbraided him with his baseness. Manox, by way of excuse, replied, that his passion for her so transported him beyond the bounds of reason that he wist not what he said. Whether Catharine had the weakness to be satisfied with this apology is not stated, but she was once, and once only, seen with him afterwards, walking at the back of the Duchess's orchard at Lambeth. Such is the history of the first error of her who was hereafter to become the Queen of England, and who was cousin german to her who then wore the crown matrimonial. But if the motherless neglected child, who was thus early beguiled from the straightforward path, be deserving of blame, what shall be said of the conduct of Mary Lassells, who, being aware of the clandestine addresses of the base Manox, and having even heard him avow designs, which the tender youth of the nobly born maiden alone prevented him from effecting, so far from warning the Duchess, or any of the members of the Howard family, of the peril of their youthful relative, actually accompanied her on a stolen expedition to the servants' hall of a neighbouring nobleman's house in quest of the profligate villain? What punishment would, in these days, be considered too severe for a nurse who could thus shamelessly betray the confidence of her employers? Surely the statements of such a person are little deserving of credit, couched as they are, too, in language which none but the most abandoned of human beings could have used. Yet it is on the testimony of this woman that Catherine Howard was eventually brought to the block. It is possible that Catherine's childish fancy for Manox originated in her musical propensities. The love of music, when indulged to excess, has not unfrequently involved elder and better educated ladies than this neglected and wrong-headed girl in perilous acquaintances and associations. Catherine's infatuation for the low-born musician was, however, of ephemeral date. Soon after her arrival at Lambeth, she was entangled in another clandestine courtship with a lover of a very different stamp from Manox, but certainly little suited for a mate to a daughter of the ducal line of Howard. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, retained in his service a band of gentlemen, whom he called his pensioners or household troop. They were for the most part persons born of better birth than fortune, and many of them claimed some degree of affinity to their lord, whom they were ready to follow to the field, to back him in his quarrels with his neighbours, or even, if required, in defiance to the sovereign. They had free quarters, good pay, and little to do, on ordinary occasions, but to seek their own amusement. The gentlemen pensioners of the Duke of Norfolk and Earl of Northumberland were the last vestige of feudal retainers, and were regarded as persons of more valour than morality. One of these bold spirits, named Francis Derham, became deeply enamoured of Catherine Howard, and being allied to her in blood, and an especial favourite with the old duchess, he aspired to nothing less than winning her for his wife. He found the young beauty only too easy of access, surrounded as she was by the unprincipled females who had previously encouraged her to listen to the addresses of Manox. Catherine appears to have been kept without money by the duchess, and, having the passion for finery natural to girls of her age, allowed Derham to supply her with all those little ornaments to her dress which she was unable to obtain for herself. On one occasion, when she was languishing to possess an artificial flower called a French fennel, which was universally worn by the ladies of Henry VIII's court, Derham told her, he knew of a little woman in London, with a crooked back, who was skilled in making all sorts of flowers of silk, and Catherine requested him to employ this person to make a French fennel for her, bidding him pay for it, and she would pay him again when she had the means. Derham complied with her wish, and when he had put her in possession of this coveted piece of finery, she dared not wear it, till she had prevailed on Lady Brereton to say she gave it to her. Derham has been represented as a person in the lowest class of society. This is a mistake, for not only was he a relation of the ducal line of Howard, but evidently a gentleman of some property. Whenever the inconsiderate Catherine desired silks, satins, or even velvet, for her habiliments, she allowed him to procure them for her, under the vague promise of reimbursing him for his outlay at some future period. She was once indebted to this perilous creditor in a considerable sum. On the New Year's Day they exchanged love tokens. Derham gave Catherine a silk heart's ease, and she gave him a band and sleeves for a shirt. These were, according to the fashion of the times, curiously wrought with the needle, probably by Catherine's own hand. Such at any rate was the report, but when questioned on this subject after she was queen, she scornfully denied that such was the fact, and said, as far as she could remember, they were wrought by Clifton's wife of Lambeth, and affirmed on oath that she never gave him any other present. Derham had also a bracelet of silken work, which had been hers, but that he took it from her perforce, she said, and kept it in her despite. He also boasted himself of a little ruby ring, but that Catherine also forswore as none of hers. It is a curious fact that Derham transferred to her an old shirt of fine holland or cambric, belonging to the deceased Lord Thomas Howard, which the duchess had given to him. The shirts worn by the gallants of Henry's court were very costly with point and fine needlework. It would have been a curious piece of costume, if Catherine had explained for what purpose she coveted that garment, and how she had exercised her ingenuity in converting it into handkerchiefs and other accessories for her wardrobe. It is too evident, from the fact of her accepting so many presents from Derham, that little attention was paid to her comforts, and that she occupied a doubtful station in the family, having neither consideration nor sympathy vouchsafed to her by those of her own rank and lineage. Her young heart thus chilled and embittered by the neglect and privations which she experienced on the one hand, and assailed by the passionate importunities of the most devoted of lovers on the other, Catherine forgot that she, in whose veins the blood of the Plantagenets and the Carlovingian monarchs mingled, was no mate for one of her uncle's gentlemen at arms, and consented to become the troth-plight or affianced wife of Francis Derham. In the days of Catholicism, such engagements were recognized by the church as binding, and if the existence of a pre-contract could be proved, it not only presented, while undissolved, an obstacle to the solemnization of matrimony between either of the parties with another person, but, if such matrimony had been contracted, rendered it illegal. History presents innumerable examples of marriages having been declared null and void, where a previous promise had been violated by either of the parties. In Scotland to this day, the acknowledgments that passed between Catherine Howard and Derham would constitute binding wedlock. Derham asked her permission to call her wife, and entreated her to call him husband, to which Catherine replied, she was content that it should be so. One day, having kissed her before witnesses, who made some observation on the freedom of his behaviour, he turned about and asked, who should hinder him from kissing his own wife? One of the bystanders then said, I trow this matter will come to pass, as the common saying is. What is that? Said Derham. Marry, replied the other, that Mr. Derham shall have Mrs. Catherine Howard. By St. John, said Derham, you may guess twice, and guess worse. The ballad lore of that age, which has always been supposed to give a lively picture of the manner of the times, is wonderfully deficient in morality, and often describes high-born ladies and lovers of low degree, acting with lamentable disregard of propriety, if any impediments to their marriage were opposed by their friends. How corrupting such chansons were to the young and thoughtless may be imagined, and Catherine Howard had no anxious mother to watch over her and inculcate principles of virtue and habits of feminine reserve. The only care the Duchess of Norfolk appears to have taken for the preservation of her youthful granddaughter's honour was, to have the doors of the chamber in which she and her waiting women slept locked every night, and the keys brought to her, but this caution was defeated by the subtlety of one or other of her attendants, by whom they were privily stolen away, and Derham was admitted to pay his nocturnal visits in defiance of all propriety. Sometimes, said Catherine, he would bring strawberries, apples, wine, and other things, to make good cheer with, after my lady was gone to bed, but that he made any special banquet, or that, by special appointment between him and me, he should tarry till after the keys were delivered to my lady, is utterly untrue, nor did I ever steal the keys myself, or desire any other person to steal them to let him in, but for many other causes the doors have been opened, and sometimes Derham hath come early in the morning, and much misbehaved himself, but never by my request or consent. It was reported by Wilkes and Baskerville, two of the unprincipled females who were the accomplices in the ruin of this hapless girl, that on one of these occasions it was asked, what shift should we make if my lady came suddenly in? And that Catherine rejoined, Derham must go into the little gallery if my lady come. Catherine denied having made this suggestion in the following words, I never said so, but he hath said it himself, and so hath he done, indeed. With equal simplicity and earnestness, she denied having received from Derham the present of a quilted cap, when destitute of the means to make such a purchase. He bought not for me the quilted cap, said she, but only the sarcenet to make it, and I delivered the sarcenet to a little fellow in my lady's house to embroider, as I remember, his name was Rose, an embroiderer, to make it what pattern he thought best, and not appointing him to make it with friars' knots, as he can testify, if he be a true man. Nevertheless, when it was made, Derham said, What, wife, here be friars' knots for Francis. Francis I had brought into fashion an enigmatical allusion to the name of Francis, devised with these friars' knots and the pansy flower. In Hall's account of the Field of the Cloth of Gold may be seen this passage. The French king and his band were apparelled in purple satin, branched with gold and purple velvet, embroidered with friars' knots, and in every knot was pansy flowers, which together signified, "Think on Francis." Katherine had certainly worn the silk pansy Derham had given her, with the cap garnished with these friars' knots, from which he drew the flattering compliment to his Christian name, that she thought of Francis. Derham gave all his money into her keeping, and once, when he was going on some secret expedition, he left the indenture for the obligation of £100 that was due to him in her custody, telling her clearly that if he never returned she was to consider it as her own. Katherine inquired whither he was going, but he would not satisfy her on that point. How long his absence lasted, and of the nature of the business in which he was engaged, there is no evidence, but as he was afterwards accused of piracy, it is possible that he embarked in a desperate enterprise of that kind with a view of improving his fortunes. Derham was occasionally tormented with jealousy and fears of losing Katherine. He especially dreaded her going to court, and as she was eager to go, they had high words on this subject. Derham told her, if she went, he would not tarry long in the house, on which she replied, he might do as he list. For the sake of obtaining more frequent opportunities of being in Katherine's company, Derham had given up his post in her uncle the duke's military retinue, and entered the service of the Duchess Dowager of Norfolk, to whom he was page or gentleman usher. After a time, the Duchess became suspicious of Derham's conduct, and was wont to exclaim, when she missed him, "Where is Derham? You shall find him in the maid's chamber or with Katharine Howard." By the maid's chamber the Duchess meant the apartment where the damsels in her state establishment sat together at their appointed tasks of embroidery, tapestry work, and spinning. One day she entered unexpectedly, and found Derham, not only trespassing within this forbidden bound, but presumptuously romping with her youthful kinswoman, Katharine Howard. On which, being greatly offended, she beat them both, and gave Mrs. Bulmer a box on the ears for sitting by and permitting such familiarity. Yet she did not dismiss Derham, because he was their relation, though she frequently chid the young lady, and sometimes punished her on his account, but the tender age of Katharine appears to have blinded her as to the peril in which she stood. At length the dreadful truth, with all its revolting circumstances, was forced upon the attention of Katharine's guardian by one of the women who had long been privy to the matter. The old Duchess once more vented her indignation upon Katharine in blows. Katharine was afterwards asked by the council of King Henry, in reference to this report, whether the Duchess struck her on the discovery of her misconduct, and how often? Her reply to this query has not been preserved. Derham would, in all probability, have paid with his blood the penalty of his audacity in bringing dishonour to one of the noblest houses in England, but he fled before the storm, and took refuge in Ireland, where, according to most accounts, he pursued the vocation of a pirate. It was doubtless when he snatched a perilous farewell of Katharine, that she, with the tears streaming down her cheeks, uttered these memorable words, "Thou wilt never live to say to me, thou hast swerved." The matter was hushed up out of respect to the feelings of Katharine's noble father, and for the sake of her sisters and other members of her illustrious family, who would have been in some degree involved in her disgrace had it been made public. Her tender age and the contaminating influence to which she had been exposed claimed also some compassion for the hapless victim who had been thus early led into sin and sorrow. The household of the Duchess was purified of the abandoned women who had warped the youthful mind of Katharine, and the damsel was herself placed under a salutary restraint. It appears, however, that she contrived, through the agency of a female in the house, named Jane Ackworth, who possessed the pen of a ready writer, to carry on a secret correspondence. After a time her secretary, as she called this person, married a gentleman of the name of Bulmer, and went to live at York. And Katharine, severed from all evil associates, acquired, as she advanced towards womanhood, the retiring grace and feminine reserve natural to that season in life. She even became remarkable for her modesty and maidenly deportment. When Derham found means to return clandestinely from Ireland, and endeavoured to renew his intercourse with her, she positively refused to have any communication with him. Reason and reflection have probably taught her to recoil with horror from the man who had cast an irredeemable blight on her opening bloom of life. Derham's attachment to her was, however, of a deep and enduring character, and his unwelcome constancy was to her productive of the most fatal results. There was at that time a report in circulation that a matrimonial engagement was in contemplation between Katharine Howard and her maternal kinsman, Thomas Culpeper, and Derham, attributing her altered manner to her preference of this gentleman, asked her angrily, if she were going to be married to him, for he had heard it so reported? What should you trouble me therewith, for you know I will not have you, was Katharine's contemptuous rejoinder, and if you heard such report, you heard more than I do know. Culpeper was Katharine Howard's first cousin, being the nephew of her deceased mother. He was in the household of Anne of Cleves, and is called by the historian Pollino a most beautiful youth. He and Katharine Howard were playmates in the same nursery in infancy. The vehement opposition of Derham to Katharine's intention of going to court appears like an assertion on his part, as far as circumstances would permit, of a right to control her actions. If, however, he possessed that right, he was in no position to enforce it, and we gather, from subsequent evidences, that he returned to Ireland long before there was a prospect of Katharine's fatal elevation to a throne. End of section 20.